As of today, actually, there are over 8.4 million people diagnosed with COVID-19 and over 445,000 deaths worldwide. In the US, there are over 2.2 million infections now and more than 118,000 deaths. And we know that the number of cases are surging in many states, particularly those in the South and Southeast. In Oklahoma, which has been in the news because of the planned Trump rally tomorrow in Tulsa, there was 450 new cases yesterday, about 150 more than the previous high earlier in the week. California has several days this week with over 5,000 new cases, the most during the pandemic. And Florida and Arizona also had the highest number of cases to date this week. As I mentioned before, the tracking of number of hospitalizations is a good way to distinguish between increasing number of cases due to testing or due to new infections. In Texas, for example, the number of people hospitalized with COVID is now approaching 3,000 a day, doubling what it was about 3 weeks ago. The CDC reported this week that out of 1.3 million COVID cases in the United States, they found that 14% of those infected ended up being hospitalized, 2% ended up in an intensive care unit, and 5% died. People with COVID who had underlying medical conditions, such as diabetes and heart disease and lung diseases, were 6 times more likely to be hospitalized and 12 times more likely to die. Data looking at COVID deaths across age groups have actually shown that the racial and ethnic disparities that we have seen are even more marked. For example, for the age group 35 to 44, there's a report from the Brookings Institution that just came out this week that showed the risk of dying is 10 times more for Blacks and 8 times more for Latinx compared to non-Hispanic whites. For ages 75 to 84, the risk is 4 times more for Black and 2 times more for Latinx. Regarding the use of masks, a study that looked at the daily growth rate of COVID cases in states that mandated face mask use showed a decline in the growth rate over time after the mandate was placed, further confirming the effectiveness of mandated face mask wearing. Yesterday, in part due to the large increase in the number of cases, California has now mandated mask wearing in most public situations. On the treatment and vaccine front, the biggest news of the week is that dexamethasone, which is a steroid drug, decreased mortality in severely ill patients with COVID. This is a study from the UK, and the results were not published via research reviews, but through a press release. So it's cautionary that we don't really know exactly how good the study is, but the findings are very impressive. Dexamethasone, just to remind people, is not a cure for COVID because it does not actually remove the virus directly, but it actually decreases the body's inflammatory response to the virus. The study randomized 2,100 patients to dexamethasone and 4,300 patients to usual care with a dose of 6 milligrams once daily for 10 days or to the point of discharge from the hospital. For those who were in the hospital but not on oxygen, the drug did not reduce any mortality, but it did reduce the risk of death among people on oxygen by 20% and those on ventilators by 35% for an overall mortality reduction of 17%. This is really great news for those who are very sick with COVID. The drug is cheap and readily available. I was asked to finish with a few comments on imagining the future of health and public health after the pandemic. As the saying goes, we shouldn't waste a good crisis. Out of this, there must come some good. I have been arguing for years that we have approached healthcare and public health the wrong way. We usually address the health for the average or default person who just happens to be white, English-speaking, employed, and well-educated. Then we look at health disparities as an afterthought. This was never going to work as a path for the future because by 2045, non-Hispanic whites will no longer be the majority. The COVID pandemic has accelerated its timeline by pointing out the terrible price paid by minorities as a result of building our healthcare and public health system on the racist principle of what works for white people. My slogan for this is there is no healthcare or health quality without equality. Any system that has disparities is a system that lacks quality. The disparities have to be addressed first, and then the quality will rise. The second good thing that I hope will come out of this pandemic is that we will fully address what we call the structural and social determinants of health. We spend way too much in this country on healthcare for the outcomes we get. We are the most expensive healthcare system on the planet and have the worst life expectancy among comparable countries. The reason is we spend money on the wrong things. The factors that contribute the most to low life expectancy are income inequality, low levels of education and exposure to violence, along with other key determinants like job, housing and food insecurity, and climate change. These are the proper topics for public health and for healthcare to work on in the future. There are metrics for healthcare quality that looks at disparities. And that only works when those metrics are broken down by race and ethnicity, right? So when you have an average healthcare quality metric, like say, for example, the number of people with hypertension who has blood pressure control, and you don't break it down by race and ethnicity, that won't work, right? Because you'll just see an average of it for everybody. And so what we're asking for is for people to report quality by race and ethnicity. That would be a good start. I think there are national measures of quality that don't actually incorporate that. And so I think we need to make sure that, for example, the HEDIS quality measure of care addresses racial and ethnic factors.
So American policing descends from the slave patrols, and it's a suppression containment policing that's done to populations that are not meant to be part of the mainstream. So in slavery, you had to keep the slaves on the plantation. The slave patrols did what they call suppression containment. It's also what was done to the Jews in the Jewish ghettos in Europe. And so when you have a system that is actually designed and descended from slavery, it's so deeply embedded in the DNA of American policing that their job is to keep Black people in their place and away from white people and wealthy people. And so out of that policing, you paramilitarize it, and you get aggressive warrior search and destroy policing that serves the larger policy of mass incarceration. So it is a toxic system. It's not about bad apples. It's about a toxic orchard. The entire culture, the entire mission. If you don't change the mission is to make sure that Black people don't come out of the ghetto, that Latino people stay in the barrio, that Native Americans stay on the reservations. When policing has as its mandate the suppression containment of a population, you get what you see in American policing. So if you get better training, it's better training for mass incarceration policing. And I don't think the people marching across the globe are asking simply for the end of murder, police murder with impunity. I don't think they're marching for kinder, gentler mass incarceration or politer search and destroy. I think what the marchers are marching for is that they are revoking their consent for aggressive enforcement, and they're demanding safety, which is not enforcement. They're demanding safety for the poorest of the poor in the highest crime zones. And they're demanding the investment, the refunding of the vitality of those communities. You have to do both. You have to fix your police, which means you have to change their mission, and you have to change their culture. They have a warrior culture of impunity. And that's what you saw when you saw Defendant Chauvin with his knee pressed into Mr. Floyd's neck. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked up at the cell phone camera, and his look said, yeah, I get to do this, and I get to do it because nothing's going to happen to me. That's the warrior culture of impunity, and it has licensed the murders that you see in the shootings of unarmed African American men mainly, by police. So you got to fix two things. It's not enough to change techniques. It's not enough to do implicit bias training. It's not enough to take away their chokehold or their tasers. It's not the weapons. It's not the training. It's the mission, the mindset, and the policies that they enforce. I think that if you have police officers with the right mindset and the right connections to the community, and they're doing the kind of safety, not policing, but delivery of safety that's done in partnership with the community. In other words, if the cops are doing what the local community wants, you don't see these kinds of problems. You see very few officer-involved shootings. And the ones that you do see are of people who are a danger to the community. It's not just rounding up every kid of color in baggy pants and having police that are armed with weapons of mass destruction from wars. I mean, the LA Unified Police, for example, asked if they could accept bayonets. And my question to them was, which children are you going to bayonet? It's gotten that kind of crazy. But disarming police is not going to work because we ask them to risk their lives in serious situations. What we're asking for is you need the warrior kind of policing in very limited circumstances. About 5% of police calls involve rape, murder, robbery, true dangers to community members. My clients who live in Watts, Los Angeles, and in East LA and Pacoima, the poorest areas of LA County, and they live in high gang territories. And they're not asking for no police. They're asking me to create policing that doesn't hunt them, that doesn't lock and put every male member of their family into a prison for life for doing nonviolent crime. They want police who understand that they're policing an area that has been made into a desert, and where there are no rungs for upward mobility, there are no jobs, there's no health care, that the police ought to be a force for helping the community get healthy. And if a healthy community doesn't have the problems, or young people only see power through gangs. So you want that sociological transformation, that community transformation. At the same time, you're transforming your police. The folks who took a hashtag, Black Lives Matter, and transformed it into an international movement demanding that Black Lives Matter is a wonder. And they get nothing but a standing ovation from me. It is an incredible thing that we are witnessing right now, and I'm sure many of you are participating in right now. The drive of enslaved peoples on all continents, that factor is what has created this moment in time in our interracial war and dialogue. This is 401 years old in the United States. It's a struggle that long. And it has always been a multiracial struggle, because this isn't South Africa. And as the minority, at least in most states, the minority, maybe in Mississippi, that African Americans are the majority, but in most of the time, we certainly didn't have the power to transform. So the state of race relations today in the United States is in a place I've never seen it. It's in a state, because for African Americans, I told one of my white partners in my law firm, I said, don't ask me. This isn't about people of color. This is the fourth major national discussion that white Americans have been having about how much racism they're currently comfortable tolerating. At the beginning of the country, they did the compromise, 3/5 of a man. The Civil War, they nominally ended slavery, reinstated it 12 years later at the end of Reconstruction, and instituted and waved in the reign of white supremacy, the lynching, the Black Code, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Revolution. They temporarily, once again, did some national laws. That revolution produced some progress, and then they spent the next 40 years undoing those laws and instituting systemic voter suppression. This is the fourth inflection on how much of white supremacy white Americans are going to condone and continue. And for the first time, you're seeing massive movements, not just the Quakers, not just the Jewish community that has always stood with at least leaders in African American leadership. It's You know, when you see little white girls with signs saying shut the whole system down, marching in a pandemic, that's never happened before. So it's influx. I call it the fourth inflection over the redemption of white supremacy, where it's the first black president. They put a white nationalist in the White House, and white people are now having that discussion. And I think for the first time, the majority of white people in America are saying, okay, we have to make a choice. Oh, okay, we didn't know we were part of the choice. We didn't know that we were in this conversation. It's like watching whales discover they live in water. But now, you know, they're starting to get consciousness. And we'll see where it goes. So it's at a point that I don't think any civil rights leaders recognize. There's an awakening. There's an awakening in many other tribes in America. But this is where we are. We're in an enormous fluctuation, turmoil. The young marchers, leaders who are around the globe have moved the tectonic plates. This is tectonic plate tsunamic level change. It's seismic. And we don't know what the politics are going to ring out. We'll see in November whether they're going to go the white nationalist way or they're going to go with the future, which is a multiracial democracy. Right now, we have an oligarchy with democratic overtones. And a full onslaught kind of adversarial positioning against the police is absolutely warranted, and that is exactly what I think the advocates should be doing. Once the protests are over, until there's an abolishment of law enforcement, in the meantime, people who are working with police to change them from gladiators to guardians have to continue that work for areas that don't have the luxury and the cohesion that the absence of police. You can have communities where you don't need police. I can show you these communities. But they are not large metropolitan areas where you have, 75 different tribes living together and extreme, deep inequality. So we're in a process right now. I think that the defund movement is about the reallocation of resources. For example, in LA, the price tag for giving South LA, just South LA alone, a poor area of LA, just the basic infrastructure, banks, grocery stores, just the basic amenities and services that give you a viable community and a little bit of ability to move upward economically, is about $6 billion just for the basics. Well, that $6 billion is 3% of the $1 trillion tax giveaway so that Eric Trump can get a second yacht. And it's 4 Boeing contracts for weapon systems that we don't need. The military tells you we don't need. You can go after police budget, but you also have to go reallocate all of the county and city monies to serve a post-COVID attack on inequality political terrain. We need to reconfigure how we use all of these budgets.
Policing is just the tip of a racist iceberg. That is, that beneath the policing are systems of educational inequality, because it's not just a question of penning people into communities, but also penning people in economically in terms of the educational opportunities that they get, in terms of the economic opportunities, and even in this current pandemic, in terms of environmental inequalities, the very air that people breathe and the way that impacts people's ability to become sick as a result of the COVID crisis. So we're in this particular moment. But I think one reason why I think this moment has broken things up so significantly is because it comes on the heels of 2 big phenomena. One, 3.5 years of Donald Trump. 3.5 years of what looks like the rise of fascism in America in terms of a big man, big lie, blaming the other, and a simplistic economic strategy. And those years have been so brutal for people of color in the United States. And we are hosting this session on the heels of the Supreme Court ruling yesterday that DACA can go forward. But for the last 3.5 years, the Trump administration has tormented 700,000 young people who are Americans in everything but the actual citizenship papers they hold. And that level of cruelty, which was demonstrated at the border in terms of the mistreatment of young people trying to come to the United States, which has been demonstrated in the treatment of African Americans with regard to, from early on, the Trump administration essentially giving a green light to police brutality. So we've had 3.5 years of really an assault on people of color rhetorically and also in terms of policy. And then came the COVID crisis. And when I speak about the COVID crisis, I often say that it is the disease that revealed our fundamental illness as a society. The precarity of employment for so many people, the lack of assets, the racial wealth gap. That means that the average white family in the United States has $175,000 of net wealth, where the average Black and Latino family in the United States has an average wealth of between $18,000 and $21,000. Those are the most recent statistics. But what that means is that when a crisis breaks, you've got no choice to go back to work because you've got no wealth cushion on which to fall. And then, of course, the fragility of people in terms of their legal status and in terms of people coming back from the criminal justice system, trying to find their toehold in labor markets. And it is not a coincidence, I think, that Rayshard Brooks bolted from the police last Saturday night. That is the young man in Atlanta who was shot in the back as he was running away from a police encounter. This is a guy who was on probation, who was worried that the misstep of driving while intoxicated was going to remove him from being able to continue to be with his family and continue to work. So we've had the 3.5 years of the Trump administration. We've had the veil unlifted on fragility, marginalization, and vulnerability as a result of the COVID crisis. And when you look at the data that the good doctor was pointing to early on in this phone call, and you recognize the significant racial disparities in terms of Black and Latino folks in particular being much more vulnerable in terms of cases and in terms of deaths. Here in California, for the population 18 to 49, prime working age, 43% of that population is Latino. There are 73% of the deaths in that age category. 6% of that population is African American. There are 9% of the deaths in that age category. So that kind of recognition, that kind of boggling recognition of racial inequality and racial disparity, into it steps the murder of George Floyd. And I feel like it's kind of broken open both communities to be able to speak for themselves, of course, in this crisis, but also folks who are in the white community to recognize that, yes, it's been a brutal period. Yes, COVID has had racial disparities, and now there's finally a recognition around policing. For us to do something very radical in America, which is to hold two ideas in our head at the same time. One, the fundamental, defining, and persistent nature of anti-Blackness and the way that that defines the racial landscape for everyone. And second, the fact that we're a multicultural society in which there are many different groups that can't be perfectly captured by that black-white narrative, even though a lot of their life chances are defined by the ways in which anti-Black racism has set the terrain for other groups, and the fact that we need to simultaneously center the struggle against anti-Black racism with the idea of broadening our perspective so that Latinos, Asian Americans, Indigenous folks, other people of color, and white allies can become part of this struggle.
Almost 10 years ago, I wrote this book called The Nature of the Future, where I talked, like a lot of people, I was very excited about the possibilities of all these connective platforms and technologies to basically catalyze new forms of value creation, you know, like open source and Wikipedia, all these very public, collaborative, basically using these platforms to create new kind of value that was unimaginable before by people coming together and collaborating and contributing little pieces. And so I developed all these scenarios for what it might look like, what governance might look like, what work might look like, and all these other things. And it was a very positive sort of vision. And at the end of it, I sort of said, well, you know, but negative scenarios are also possible. The possibility of what I call digital feudalism, which is basically in feudal societies, you had commons areas where the peasants were cultivating things, but basically they were living subsistence existence, and the lords were getting taxes and the wealth and everything else. And here we are. I think like we basically built the digital neo-feudalistic economies, or what some would say plantation economies, because most of the people who are living on these scraps of commons, which are awful, use the terms like communities. I love that Facebook loves to use this term. We're a global community without really understanding what a community is. So basically where we've gone is all these promise of these commons creating an incredibly positive platforms and technology has been converted into actually reinventing feudalism or plantation economies. So I've been doing a lot of reflections, obviously, in this moment, like what happened? Why did this happen? And obviously, you know, just having technologies was not enough. And so what we need, and I think where we are, hopefully now, Dr. Rice was talking about tectonic change, and I'm really hoping that in this process of tectonic change, we really need to develop a new kind of ideology and a new set of norms of what is normal. And I think, you know, Karl Polanyi, who was an economist, and wrote a lot during World War II and was highly influenced by it. He talked about how the market economies not just produce market economies, they produce market societies where people's thinking get marketized. So a lot of things that were part of the social contract, we start thinking about them in market terms. And I think this is what's been happening. We've marketized our thinking. So our ideas, and this is why some of these technologies went in this direction, is that we couldn't think differently. Like here we are, we have these amazing technologies, right? But they're falling into business models and the frameworks that basically are anti-commons, that basically are feudal in their way. So I've been thinking a lot, and I'm really hopeful in this moment that in addition to all the racial inequalities and policing and all these things coming to the fore that are now being revealed, that we also, it's an opportunity for us to rethink some of these pillars, economic pillars, and kind of what we think of as normal, of how we treat workers, about what is deserved in this economy, who deserves these things, that all of these things are being rethought and reconsidered. And I'm just gonna list some of the things that I'm thinking about is, for example, the concept, you know, Silicon Valley thrives on this concept of a hero entrepreneur, right? And it sort of became how many people have come to Silicon Valley to look at a model like we want to build our own Silicon Valley. I hope that's the end of it, because I really believe, as much as I believe in innovation and everything else, but the whole concept of this hero entrepreneur, that there are certain people that because of their great IQs, intelligence, or their great effort, or because of their birth, that they deserve these outside rewards for whatever these things. Like, we need to sort of really debunk this concept of rugged individualism. Like, what we are seeing clearly in this period is that we're all connected. Our health is connected. All health is public health, ultimately. You're only as healthy as a homeless person next to you. And so we need to kind of go from this idea of rugged individualism, which is so much of part of the American ethos, as part of the, you know, the kind of capitalist economy that we've created here in the US, not so much in Europe, that we recognize this interdependence and we develop these new ideals of mutualism, because ultimately we need to think in terms of interconnectedness. All these things that we're facing today, from health to climate, they cannot be solved by one community, one individual. These are global issues. There are no borders around health, as we're seeing with coronavirus, same with climate. So kind of debunking the whole admiration for this rugged individualism. I mean, we're seeing already debunking of whole ideas of work, like the concept of essential work and who does essential work is now front and center, right? It's not the Wall Street bankers who are doing essential work. You know, David Graeber, economic anthropologist, talks about bullshit jobs. And, you know, bullshit jobs are the kind of jobs that it's not collecting your garbage. It's not providing care. It's all these, it's not teaching. Like, we're really reconfiguring what essential work is. And once we reconfigure that, we really need to ask ourselves a question: are we compensating these people? Can they afford a living? Can they afford to do the kind of essential work? And why are we not able to compensate them in this way? I think the other sort of concept I've been thinking about is the concept of ownership. It's something that people negotiate in every economy. You know, there's always a tension between private accumulation and access to public and commons-based resources. And, you know, it's a role of government to sort of navigate that and make sure that this balance exists. And we're definitely out of balance. The notion, we need to examine the notion of, do people have a right to own land? How much land? Manuel talked about incredible asset inequalities. This is something that, you know, we've written a lot about, the concept of universal basic assets. Can we think about as a right, not something that you have to earn, but as a human being, you have access to certain kind of essential assets that enable you to live good lives? And what does this package look like? I also, you know, the other thing that's been interesting to me to watch, we all worry about work, and we think of it as an absolutely necessary thing for our well-being, for our social standing and everything else. But I've been thinking a lot, why are these protests happening right now? And I feel like people's time has been liberated. You know, a lot of it not by choice, but people are doing essential work. They're doing essential civic work. They're going to demonstrations, they're learning, they're participating. I've been calling in, and I'm not in LA, but I've been fascinating. I've been calling into city council meetings in LA, which are just fascinating. This is citizenship in action. These are people participated in public discussions. I called into police commission meetings, which were just amazing. For 9 hours, people calling in and were in line on the phone to express their rage, mostly about the police. So, and the final thing that I think we need to, you know, every organization, every foundation, everything we do, always this concept of scale. But is it scalable? Do you need to scale? And we apply it to everything. And here's the thing about scale is that scale reduces diversity. And we're seeing we have, you know, one of the amazing things to watch was that, you know, are these great global companies so successful, right? And we can't deliver masks. We don't have enough gloves. We don't have enough of these real essential things. So you kind of, and that's because of scale, right? Because they're so efficient, but efficiency also leads to brittleness, right? You cut all the slack out of the systems. So when we have surge, you don't have enough supplies, you can't meet. So scale by itself is actually needs to be balanced with resilience, and resilience requires this kind of redundancy and duplication and nuance and diversity. And so we need to debunk this concept of scale. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have to exist, but we have to be not applying it to everything and everybody. So to me, the question and the opportunity, and what I'm excited about is that I think we have the possibility, as everybody said, we don't know where this is going to go. And I'm a futurist, and I can tell you that nobody can predict the future. But this is a possibility for us to actually rebuild the basic civic infrastructure of our society, which includes everything from our cultural norms to our institutions to our basic ideology. And that is, I hope that this is an opportunity we're not going to lose.